For the first time ever, I am thrilled to say we have an official sponsor for the Dirt Talk podcast, and that's Ariat. I've worn Ariat boots on every job site I've visited over the years, traveling in them across 5 continents. More importantly, I have yet to find a single project where working folks, unlike me, are not wearing Ariat boots and workwear in every condition imaginable. And there's really good reason for that, and that's because it's phenomenal stuff. And the more I've learned about Ariat and the company, the more I've loved their brand. So with this, Ariat is offering any Dirt Talk listener 10% off their next Ariat order at ariat.com/dirttalk. That's 10% off boots, jeans, and workwear at ariat.com/dirttalk or at the link in this episode's description. With that, let's get to the show. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Monday episode, Dirt Talk podcast. Thank you for being here with me. I very much appreciate it. All 3 of you. It's always good to have you. I have previously read from a book called The Kiewit Story. Pretty straightforward. The Kiewit Story. It's an older book by Hollis Limprecht. It was published, I believe, in 1981 was the copyright. Brilliant book about Peter Kiewit and the history of Kiewit. Good luck finding it. I was given this as a gift, which is very cool. It's very hard to find otherwise. However, I am here to share with you another chapter. This is chapter 16 called Oil from Alaska. I previously read about Kiewit's venture in Greenland, which is quite interesting. And as I was reading this book, the Alaska chapter came up, and I thought it was equally as fascinating. So I thought maybe you would enjoy hearing it and enjoy it as much as I did as well. So here we are reading from the Kiewit Story. Sorry, my voice is a little off today, but just deal with it. The people of Peter Kiewit Sons, Inc. are deeply involved in helping ease the nation's energy burden. They have built a wide variety of electric power plants and have become the 10th largest coal producer in the United States. But probably Peter Kiewit & Sons' most spectacular contribution to the field of energy is the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. PKS didn't build all of the pipeline and its facilities, but it was a major factor in this at $8 billion, the largest single free enterprise construction project in history. As an individual contractor and as a member of 2 separate joint ventures, the Kiewit organization helped build the 3 components of the Alaskan oil project. The 3 at the Prudhoe Bay oil field on the coastline of the Arctic Ocean, where the 798-mile pipeline begins. PKS was selected to construct the oil flow stations and drill site facilities. These are the processing facilities that get the crude oil on its way through the pipeline. 2, on the pipeline itself, PKS was a joint venture partner in building the northernmost 200 miles of the line, running south from Prudhoe Bay. And 3, at Valdez, Alaska, at the southern end of the pipeline, PKS was the sponsor of a joint venture to construct the marine loading docks for ocean-going tankers that carry to the lower 48 states the 2 million barrels a day produced at Prudhoe's fields. The pipeline, which stirred the world's imagination, is owned and operated by a group of 7 of the free world's major oil companies, who combined under the name of the Alaska Pipeline Service Company. They are working one of the world's largest petroleum deposits, an estimated 10 billion barrels, maybe more. It was natural that PKS would submit construction proposals in 1974 when Alaska decided to drill the North Slope fields, discovered in 1968 by Atlantic Richfield and Exxon. After all, PKS, some 20 years before, had acquired vast experience working in the unfriendly atmosphere of Greenland and had done much work in Alaska since. "We figured if anyone could do it, we could do it," said Edward C. Lynch of Vancouver, Washington. PKS Vice President and Regional Manager for work in the Western states and Alaska. We had worked all over Alaska in a variety of conditions, and we have worlds of good people. Construction work has the same basic principles no matter where you build. The difference is in the scale. As a result, PKS, in one form or another, singly or in partnership, was involved in pipeline construction from the summer of 1974, when it got a head start in laying the groundwork for the pipeline itself, to July of 1977, when the first North Slope oil arrived at the loading facilities at Valdez, now one of the world's largest oil terminals. And just my side note, 3 years to build that project, that would take 20 nowadays. The Ralph M. Parsons Company, acting as managing contractor for Atlantic Richfield, awarded PKS a $55 million contract for the construction of a major portion of the permanent crude oil processing facilities at Prudhoe Bay. Prudhoe is well above the Arctic Circle, located on the Arctic Ocean some 200 miles southeast of Point Barrow. It is a harsh, rugged, barren wilderness, barely tolerable to man, where the temperature ranges from a summer average of about 40 degrees to 60 below in the long, dark winters. It is then that the frigid winds, with a force of up to 100 miles per hour, can plunge the wind chill to 150 below. While it doesn't snow much there, annual precipitation is only 4 to 6 inches, those same winds blowing in drifting snow from the polar ice cap to the north. ARCO's needs were drill site facilities, flow stations, and the central compressor plant. The function of the drill site facilities is to collect and transfer the crude oil, gas, and water from the wellhead to the flow stations. Each drill site serves from 17 to 29 wells operated by Alaska employees, with apparatus to sample and test the crude at each individual well and monitor its performance. At the flow station, crude is separated, the water is returned to the earth, and the natural gas is collected for transmission to the central gas compressor plant. The oil is cleaned, metered, and sent on its way through lines to pump station number 1, where it enters the Trans-Alaska Pipeline for its long journey southward. PKS forces began at Prudhoe Bay in August 1975, 10 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year round. At first, all activity was directed towards erecting temporary facilities and getting ready for the summer sea lift of materials and equipment. The permanent process buildings at Prudhoe were fabricated in Seattle and transported to northern Alaska on ocean-going barges and tugs. The building modules weighed in the neighborhood of 160 tons apiece, 2 stories with a 3-story stair tower and connecting corridors. Built of steel framing, moisture-resistant drywall, and insulated metal paneling, they house the crude oil processing equipment, pipes, pumps, tanks, and compressors, and are all connected by miles of power and control cables. Self-contained heating, ventilating, and plumbing systems are also included. During the summer, there is only a narrow window of time open for bringing material by sea into Prudhoe Bay. In the 75 season, barges loaded with cargo left Seattle in June and July. Arrival at Prudhoe was scheduled for early August, but the Arctic ice pack remained fast against the shore. Some of the general cargo barges turned back to South Alaska, and 60,000 tons of cargo was loaded onto trucks at Anchorage and transported over the 800-mile-long pipeline haul road to Prudhoe in 3,500 separate truckloads. It was a sight through the summer twilight. Huge trucks bumper to bumper in the unpopulated land. Authorities decided that an additional attempt would be made to get many of the barges bearing the modules through the Arctic ice pack, and it worked. But by the time the modules reached Prudhoe Bay, winter had closed in, locking several barges in the bay until the 1976 breakup. The builders were faced with a decision. Should they sit and wait out the winter for offloading next spring, or should an effort be made to bring the modules onshore in the face of the winter elements? It was decided they could get the job done despite the numbing cold and howling winds. The first step was to build gravel causeways from shore to each of the barges and then to inch 1,300-ton modules onto carriers and creep along the causeway to their proposed sites. The unloading process never knew the difference between night and daylight hours, and what had been scheduled to be completed in the perpetual daylight of the summer went through the Arctic night of winter. The modules were hauled over 5-foot thick gravel roads and put into place on similar 5-foot gravel pads. The pads protected the delicate tundra beneath. The modules were hauled into place and leveled and aligned on piles topped with concrete caps, 3 feet in diameter and 4 feet high, through the use of a unique hydraulic jacking system that aligned the buildings vertically and horizontally. Aligning the modules required up to 12 jacks, all controlled from a single console, and the module base plates had to be welded to prevent movement of the pile caps in high winds. The flow station consists of 20 interconnected modules with piping up to 30 inches in diameter. Performs all of the necessary functions of a crude oil facility operating in the more friendly climates of Oklahoma, Texas, or the Middle East. Hundreds of instruments were installed under the most difficult of conditions, and miles of small tubing and wires were put into place. There was no local power company to plug into, so PKS had to install its own power plant. Warehousing was a part of the operation, but when materials were stored outside, it sometimes became a difficult job even to find the materials under their blanket of ice and snow. At the end of the work shift, the quarters housing work personnel became the center of a small city, serving some 1,700 appetites with square yards of steak. A supply of tools and equipment to keep the workers going was assured by the PKS support office in Anchorage, where they worked 10-hour shifts but only 6 days a week. Payroll information was transmitted by satellite telephone circuit to PKS computers in Omaha. Data was sent back the same way to check printers in Anchorage. Then the checks were flown north to Prudhoe to make sure they were delivered on time. Prudhoe Bay work was finished well ahead of the time the oil spigot was first turned on, and the PKS president Bob Wilson noted in the winter of 76-77 that the company had worked 1 million man-hours at Prudhoe without a single lost time accident. That amazing safety performance brought this response from Atlantic Richfield executive. This record is unusual in the lower 48 states and almost unheard of in the Arctic. When one considers the hazards and the great number of potential accident situations that could occur on a job of this magnitude, you begin to realize the tribute that is due your people. They have achieved this record in spite of the harsh environment that necessitates heavy work clothing that restricts movement, dexterity, and vision. You ought to be extremely proud. PKS people were proud, but they were busy too. While some were mopping up at Prudhoe, others were continuing work on the pipeline itself. PKS was part of a joint venture that included the Williams Brothers Company of Tulsa, Oklahoma, pipeline constructors, plus 3 others. The 5 were awarded a contract to build sections 5 and 6 of the pipeline, roughly the northern 200 miles over the Brooks Range and virtually to the Arctic Ocean. PKS assumed the primary responsibility for the earth moving and the crushing and screening of granular materials, but ultimately it did much more, including drilling some 20,000 holes for the vertical supports of that part of the pipeline routed above the surface of the ground. The pipeline tried to follow a route where there was good gravel, and for 100 miles of the way, it paralleled the Sag River. Working conditions weren't too bad during the summer, not unlike what most PKS people were used to. But Ed Lynch remembers a snowfall on August 29. The snow was splitting and it was bitter cold, and I thought, we'll never see the sun again until next summer. But it wasn't true. The snow ended. June, July, and August were the only months of good weather, but that didn't stop the project. Construction continued through the cheerless winters. It wasn't as difficult as you might think, said Lynch. Half of the battle is to be adequately prepared with proper clothing and proper equipment and a proper camp. Certainly, some days were impossible, but I think some periods of winter in Wyoming are even worse. It's the chill factor in Wyoming that gets you. Arctic winters prove that men can work under extremes more severe than metal can. The equipment would give up before the men. We kept the machines running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, said Lynch. If a piece shut down at 40 below zero and got frozen up, then you had a real problem. Sometimes a piece of machinery could be shut off for an hour or two for repairs while it remained hot so that it would start again. Sometimes it would be necessary to erect a tent around the piece of equipment and bring in heaters. The trick was to get the machine into a shop before it broke down so that repairs could be made inside, not 30 or 40 miles out into the bleak countryside. Sometimes the bitter cold simply crystallized the metal and it broke. The Sag River reminded PKS people of the Platte, and sand and gravel and rock were removed from alongside it for the aggregate, several million cubic yards of it. Borrow pits, the term is taken from the fact that gravel is borrowed from the river, were to be established up and down the pipeline route. But after work was begun, it was discovered that not as many borrow pits would be allowed by Alaska authorities. They were concerned about preserving the fish life in the Sag River, and consequently, some hauls from borrow pits to work sites were as long as 10 to 12 miles. There were 3 choices for borrow material: gravel, rock, or permafrost. Since permafrost is simply frozen slop, it was avoided wherever possible. In winter, the frozen gravel was blasted loose, and sometimes the blasters got frozen boulders rather than workable gravel. In summer, they would work off the top of the gravel deposit at a rate of about 6 inches per day. That's how much would thaw off the top in a 24-hour period. About half of the 200 miles of the pipeline by the joint venture was above ground. Half below, which meant the ditches had to be blasted out of the permafrost as well. Camps were established along the pipeline, portable facilities that were built in Canada and trucked in. Each camp held from 1,000 to 2,000 workers, was operated by an independent catering firm, and provided excellent food and shelter. A work schedule was established that allowed craftsmen to work 8 weeks and then take 2 weeks of R&R in Anchorage or Fairbanks. Workers who went up to the pipeline, understanding the conditions for the most part, had little trouble with their assignments. They could quit anytime they wanted to, but the 8 weeks on and time off proposition made it more acceptable. Yet the isolation made its imprints too. Ed Lynch tells of walking into an office at Prudhoe Bay and being asked by a young man, perhaps 19 or 20, who won the football game. What game? Nebraska. Ed asked, "Is this Saturday?" "Sure is," replied the young man. "I bet $100 on the outcome." Here's a young fellow betting $100 at a crack because he has more money than he ever had in his life. And I don't even know it's Saturday, said Lynch. Not all working men bet their salaries. The going wage was in the neighborhood of $60,000 a year plus room and board. And Lynch knew of one fellow who worked for 2 years and bought a farm in the lower 48. Some would get upset over seemingly trivial matters and suddenly quit. Perhaps they were moved from one piece of machinery to another. That might be enough to trigger a deep frustration and resentment against working conditions. Pipeline not only caught the imagination of the entire world, but especially members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, otherwise known as OPEC. Then a scandal hit the pipeline project, a scandal that ordinarily would have been so insignificant as to hardly bear mentioning. But because it was the pipeline, this grandiose project to span nearly 800 miles of hostile country with a man-made structure, it was blown into something that rocketed around the world. The problem involved some welds. Every welded joint in the pipeline was X-rayed to detect flaws. This X-ray inspection was done by an independent company, not by any of the construction firms. But mud once slung tends to splatter. Somewhere along the length of the pipeline, a total of 33 weld X-rays were apparently falsified. Either the X-rays were never taken, or they were taken and lost, or they were taken and some inspector thought at best they were misplaced. In any case, 33 duplicated X-rays were substituted for the missing ones, and the duplication was discovered. An inspector for the state of Alaska later told a PKS executive that perhaps 175 welds should have been X-rayed again. In the end, 4,000 were repeated. Of this number, 2,000 were in the 200 miles of pipeline laid, either in ditches or above-ground structures by the PKS joint venture. For the underground sections, the ground cover had to be removed, often frozen, a wrapping removed, and the welds re-X-rayed. If the ground wasn't frozen, sometimes the ditch filled with water, and that had to be pumped out. Pete Kiewit came up on an inspection flight and saw what looked like thousands of holes pockmarking the route of the line. Needless to say, he was upset. Flabbergasted is the word Ed Lynch uses to describe Pete's reaction. He had been involved in ungainly projects before, said Lynch. He thought there was no way we could get the work corrected by winter, but I assured him we could, and did. Some sections of pipe were 40 feet long, some 60 feet, and some 80 feet, so often it was guesswork to determine the location of the welds, and maybe up to 60 or 70 feet of pipe would have to be unearthed. The 48-inch diameter steel pipe varied in thickness, but averaged 0.62 inches thick. Some of the imperfect welds could be corrected by having a welder crawl inside the pipe. Others required removing a segment of pipe and replacing it, a procedure that required 2 welds to replace one. Then the dirt was recompacted around the pipeline. Pete Kiewit was deeply concerned about the Kiewit reputation and worried that some of the poor performance of others might soil PKS's linen. But nearly every official, Alaska people, and the design and the construction management firms who played a major role in the project came away with respect for PKS, not only in the way PKS handled its own responsibilities, but the way it helped correct the mistakes of others. 2 other minor problems developed. Once, water froze inside the pipe and had to be bored out. And once the shifting ground of the Brooks Range Mountains caused a break, which was quickly repaired. But all in all, the pipeline was performed beautifully, and oil was flowing the summer of '77 right on schedule. It flowed to Valdez, where simultaneously with its Prudhoe Bay and pipeline work, PKS was constructing the oil loading facilities in a joint venture with the Willamette Western Corporation on a $150 million contract. The joint venture was known as Key West. How clever. The project involved building 4 tanker berths, 3 fixed and 1 floating, just off the shoreline in deep water. As with the 2 other projects, Valdez required a mix of talents and began with mobilization of men and material in the Richmond, Washington, and Portland, Oregon area. Whatever was going to be needed, from the largest derrick to the smallest wrench, had to be brought up from the lower 48 states. Barges, which brought up equipment, remained on the job site and were used for storing the steel structures. Steel dock sections were fabricated by Kaiser Steel Company in California and the Nippon Steel Corporation of Japan, all of which had to be brought in via ship or barge and tug. It was a touchy business. High winds and rough seas were a part of the sea lanes the year round. Drills that were going to be drilling holes for the foundation of the fixed berths were tested at Portland on rock harder than anything they would come up against at Valdez. The holes were 24 to 54 inches in diameter and averaged 35 feet in depth through bedrock that sometimes was covered in 80 feet of water and another 50 or so feet of mud. Much of the bedrock lay at a 60-degree angle from the horizontal. 2 of the 3 fixed berths were more than 1,200 feet from shoreline, thereby requiring long access trestles to and from the berths. The floating berth was the most unusual and was decided upon by designers because the water was too deep for adequate piling. 2 of the largest fixed berths were built during the first 2 seasons at Valdez, And while they were under construction, preparations were being made for the fabrication and transportation of the floating berth. It was put together at the Nippon Steel fabrication yards, and it was so big that workers at one end used walkie-talkies to communicate with workers at the other end. Originally, the 3,300-ton tubular steel structure was to be floated from Tokyo to Valdez, but finally a decision was made to load it on a submersible barge measuring 100 feet by 400 feet and tow it across the ocean. When this ungainly cargo arrived at Valdez, it was greeted by typical Valdez weather. It snowed 5 separate times during a 12-hour period. The shoreside anchor for the berth consisted of 2 giant ball sockets, which allow the floating berth to rise and fall with the 19-foot tides. Connection of the floating steel with the fixed socket went surprisingly smoothly. A real gentle push, called the PKS man to the tugboat captain. 3 feet, 2 feet, 1 foot, mark. It was done. Valdez weather was different from the weather up at Prudhoe, where it snowed but little, although snow blew in from the north. At Valdez, the workmen had to put up with nearly 60 inches of precipitation a year, much of it in the form of 30 feet of heavy, wet snow. Often a shift's work began with removing the accumulated ice and snow, and life jackets were as much a part of the gear as hard hats. Up to 3,500 working men and women were on hand at a time. The men took a little time off on July 4th, 1976, to help the citizens of Valdez celebrate with a bicentennial day parade, then went back to work. And at the end, all the tools and machinery brought up had to be loaded and tied down again and transported back to the Richmond-Portland area. The berths, several buildings, and storage tanks with a capacity of 510,000 barrels were ready for business when the first oil arrived from Prudhoe. Today, the oil is flowing. So that is another reading from the book, The Kiewit Story. I have not actually finished the book yet. So if I wander into any other exciting chapters, I will make a note and potentially read them for you all. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. It's just completely mind-boggling what people have done in the past to build our world. I think we take it for granted. I know I take it for granted, but reading accounts like this that are so brilliant and well-written are just quite eye-opening. So, like I said, hopefully you enjoyed that. If you have anything else you'd like me to read, send us a note, dirttalk@buildwith.com. We would love to hear from you. If you enjoyed it, send it to someone else who might enjoy it. We appreciate you always sharing the podcast, and we will see you on the next one. Stay dirty, everybody.